We're turning our attention again to the book of Psalms in our study of Messianic Prophecy. And we're now going to be looking at Psalm 8, kind of going through these first couple Psalms here. And Psalm 8 has some rather interesting features, characteristics. And one of the big issues in Psalm 8 is why is it viewed as a Messianic Psalm? The reality is that if the book of Hebrews had not quoted this Psalm directly, we wouldn't perhaps quite fully understand the Messianic implications of this particular passage. It is quoted elsewhere in the New Testament, Matthew 21:16, the triumphal entry, where the children are praising here, and that's a quotation out of Psalm 8 as well. But it's the book of Hebrews, Hebrews chapter 2, that really gives a lengthy quotation from this psalm and makes it clear that we are to understand Christ as fulfilling the language of Psalm 8. I think it's always important to step back and say, in any study of Messianic prophecy, why do we believe this particular verse is Messianic? Sometimes people cite verses and they see the language maybe sounding somewhat Messianic and automatically apply it to Christ, and maybe not always in a proper way. There's debate, for example, in 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 10. That's the prayer of Hannah, Samuel's mother. And at the end of Hannah's prayer, it reads, "The Lord will judge the ends of the earth, and will give strength to His king, and will exalt the horn of His anointed one." And that's often taken as a messianic prophecy, but within the context of 1 Samuel 2, there's not really a lot there to commend itself as messianic. And you could quote church fathers and theologians, John Calvin, others will talk about it being messianic. But the bottom line is there still is some doubt as to what extent that particular reference to the Anointed One could be viewed as messianic. So we need to have some caution. We just shouldn't refer to everything as messianic with the idea that, well, it all points to Jesus. Kind of like the story of the boy that cried wolf. I'll tell a story about my son Michael. He's in college now, but many years ago, it was my first occasion to tell him the story of the boy that cried wolf. I don't know what he had done to deserve this, but I went into that story and made it very clear that the little boy, because he cried wolf so many times when there was no wolf, when the wolf actually came, no one would believe him. So I told the story the matter-of-fact way that the wolf attacked. He cried out, no one helped, and the wolf ate him, and that was pretty much the end of the story. I thought that would make a good point. Well, my son was rather sensitive at that time, and he began to cry. It really upset him, the idea of this wolf swallowing the little boy. So I quickly did a revision of the boy that cried wolf. It went something like this. The townspeople did not hear the cry of the little boy. The wolf attacked the little boy and seriously injured him. They rushed him to the hospital where he made a full recovery. And that was the revised version of that story. Well, the principle, I think, for us in Messianic prophecy is important, and that is, we don't want to just simply refer to any passage as being a prophecy of Jesus unless we have good reason to do so. It's the idea that if everything is a prophecy of Jesus, then in another sense, nothing is a special prophecy of Jesus. So Psalm 8 is one of those texts that is messianic, and we need to ask the question, why? I would suggest right now, maybe you might want to put your at home on pause there and just take a look at Psalm 8, read it in your translation. I'll be looking at the New American Standard and looking at some specific language there. But go ahead and put it on pause, and then we're going to talk about some specific aspects of this psalm. Well, let's turn to Psalm 8 then, and as you have read, it's a psalm about creation. In fact, I've called this the creation mandate. And in the creation mandate, God is proclaiming man's special role over creation. It says that the heavens, the work of His fingers, all the things that God has made, and yet God has given man a very special place in this created order. There in verse 4, what is man that you take thought of him, and the Son of Man that you care for him? Yet you made him a little lower than God, and dost crown him with glory and majesty. You make him rule over the works of thy hands. You've put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, and the beasts of the field, and the birds of the heavens, and the fish of the sea, whatever passes through the paths of the sea. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is thy name in all the earth. Well, some of the language there, I think, has to really be carefully understood. So under significant terminology, and we note that this is a Psalm of David in the Psalm heading, we have this term Son of Man. I would caution you against just assuming that because the term Son of Man occurs in a biblical text, that refers to Jesus, the Son of Man. Son of Man in Hebrew is really another way of saying man. And we find it in parallel texts like this. You notice that the first half of verse 4 says, what is man? And the second half says, and the Son of Man. And man, Son of Man, are two ways of speaking about humanity. In Hebrew, to describe the membership in a particular class, the term son of would be used. Think about some of the language in the New Testament. Barnabas was the son of encouragement. Judas, the son of perdition. And so that concept of characterizing something or someone by the term son of is a common Hebrew way of expressing things. And so it's not messianic just because the phrase Son of Man is there. I would suggest that we should resist that temptation. If the phrase Son of Man is messianic in verse 4, then the term man must be messianic as well, because they are parallel. They are talking about the same individual. So let's at least for the time being, resist that automatic assumption that Son of Man is a title for Jesus, therefore this is messianic. Let's look at the language now in verse 5. A little more discussion there. You have made him a little lower than God. I would put in parentheses here the angels, a little lower than the angels. Now that's how the NIV understands it. Looking here at the NIV, at Psalm 8, you made him a little lower than the heavenly beings. And that's an attempt to try to express what's being said there in the Hebrew text. Now the Greek Septuagint, the Old Testament in Greek, translated the word God here with the word angeloi, angels. That would be a normal translation of the Hebrew word malakim, the Hebrew word for messengers. So the Hebrew word messenger, the Greek term angelos, messenger, or, quote, our English word angel coming from angelos. But this is not the Hebrew word malakim, this is the Hebrew word Elohim. Now, Elohim in the Old Testament has three possible meanings. The vast majority of times, Elohim is a special form, and it is a plural form with a singular meaning applying to God. It is a plural of majesty. Hebrew would express things that were great in terms of using the plural for singular ideas. If this is the greatest podium in the world, I could call it podiums. And so, Elohim, most of the time, in its roughly 2,500 occurrences, refers to God. And the grammar agrees with that. It's not Elohim, they said, but Elohim, he said. Other forms like El would be singular, and there are rarer forms like Eloah. But Elohim is the most common use of this name or title for God, along with Jehovah or Yahweh, which occurs the most. Here, Elohim seems not to refer to Almighty God. And I would take exception with the New American Standard's decision to translate that as God, even though that is the way that it is most often translated. The term Elohim could sometimes refer to false gods. That doesn't really fit this context either. If you have a phrase that says, "You will have no other Elohim before me," then it's clear that in that case, it's not God with a capital G, but rather gods with a small g. And so Elohim could refer to a general plural term referring to the gods of the nations. Elohim can also refer then to other beings. It is possible that Elohim simply refers to angels. Now, in the book of Job, the phrase sons of Elohim, the B'nai Elohim, quote, the sons of God, seems to refer to angelic creatures, and Satan or Satan is mentioned there as one of those creatures that has access to God there in the first chapters of the book of Job. So Elohim could have to do with angelic beings. That seems to be closer to what we have here. Another meaning, actually a fourth meaning for the term Elohim, found in some places like Psalm 82, is the reference to human rulers. After all, the word El and Elohim simply means mighty one or mighty ones. And in John 10, the passage is actually quoted by Christ, and he basically uses the common rabbinic understanding of the passage and uses it against them in that context. But he quotes that and recognizes that when they are called gods in Psalm 82, that's a reference to human beings, human rulers, perhaps human judges. And there may be another passage or two in which human judges are referred to as Elohim. It's very rare. Probably less striking would be the use of mighty ones or Elohim in reference to heavenly beings. That's how the Septuagint took it. Now, the reason why I take exception to the New American Standard Bible is that if a translation, even though it's a potentially good translation of a passage, does not make sense theologically or logically, then we need to look for something else. In this psalm, you have made him a little lower than Elohim. Now, it's talking about man. And the problem I have with that translation of God is that although it's possible Hebrew, theologically, is it true that God made man a little lower than himself? I would say there's a big difference between God the Creator and man the created. And so I would argue against the New American Standard Translation, and frankly would prefer the NIV in this case, and that is that the Elohim are heavenly beings. Now that's an attempt, I think, to get at the Septuagint idea without directly using the word angels. The Septuagint translators were struggling for a Greek word to use for Elohim, and they did not view that to be a reference to God either. And so they felt that they should refer to heavenly beings, and they chose the specific heavenly being, the angel. So angeloi is the Septuagint translation. And I think that makes better sense. It is true that God, when we think about the heavenly beings, and in the book of Hebrews, which quotes this, certainly there was a great interest in the first century, the Jews with angels and Melchizedek. We'll talk about that more when we get to Psalm 110. But the idea that angels are mighty beings, heavenly beings, I mean, the power that they have and the abilities that they have would seem to suggest that man in some ways is made lower than them. And that, I think, makes sense theologically to describe man as a little lower than angels who stand in the very presence of God, but it doesn't make sense to me to say that man is a little lower than God. So I would take that translation, heavenly beings, and use that. Now Hebrews 2 And understand that when the book of Hebrews quotes the Old Testament, it invariably uses the Greek Septuagint, the Old Testament in Greek. So we would not expect anything else but angeloi there in this particular passage, and that's what we have. In Hebrews 2, let's set the stage as we think about what these first couple chapters of Hebrews are all about. In chapter 1, we read, I think, an answer to the question, how can Jesus be God? Is he God? And the superiority of Christ to the angels and to Moses and to Aaron, to the prophets there at the beginning of the book. Superior revelation through the Son. Not a servant, but a son. Not a prophet, but a son. And that's why Hebrews quotes from Psalm 2 and why it quotes from 2 Samuel 7:14. To which of the angels did he ever say, "Thou art my son, today I have begotten thee"? Christ is superior to the angels, and the superiority of Christ to the angels is the focus of Hebrews chapter 1. Verse 8, we'll look at Psalm 45 a little bit later here. Of the Son, he says, "Thy throne, O God, is forever and ever." And so the eternality and the deity and the equality with the Father is being given to the Son in Hebrews chapter 1. So the idea that Jesus is both God and man, God in the flesh, both aspects of that are addressed in these first chapters of Hebrews. Chapter 1 addresses the issue of Jesus as God. Chapter 2 addresses the issue of Jesus as man. Now, there's several things that we could say about why Jesus became man. Probably the most obvious thing for us is if we go to the end of our passage that we're particularly concerned about and look at the application of that. It says in verse 9 that we see him who's been made for a little while lower than the angels, namely Jesus, because of the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor, that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. Why did God become man? Why did Jesus take on human flesh? It was to be an atoning sacrifice for our sins. And so to do that, in order to taste death for every man, he himself had to be made for a little while human. We drop down to verse 14 of chapter 2. We see similar language there. Since the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise also partook of the same. He became flesh, that through death he might render powerless him who had the power of death, that is, the devil, and might deliver those who through fear of death were subject to slavery all their lives. That's another answer to the question, why was Jesus man? Why did God become human, take on flesh, the incarnation? Christ was human so that he might taste death for every man, so that he might render powerless the one who had the power of death. Christ, through his victory over death and the grave and Satan, accomplishes something that he could not have done had he not become man. And so that's one of the answers. A second answer is at the very end of chapter 2, where it talks about him being a merciful and faithful high priest. And it says that since he himself was tempted in that which he has suffered, he is able to come to the aid of those who are tempted. How can he become a high priest for us? How can he atone for sin for us? How can he intercede for us if he himself has not experienced human temptation? If he himself has not taken on the frailty of humanity? And so Jesus became man so that he might taste death for everyone, and so that he might be able to function as our faithful and sympathetic high priest. It's hard to have sympathy unless one has walked in their shoes, and Jesus certainly walked in our shoes in becoming flesh for us. Well, Psalm 8 points to the third answer to the question, why did Jesus become man? In a sense, I would simply say that Jesus became man in order to fulfill God's promise to man that He expressed at creation. And that's why I'm saying here now that it's not the language Son of Man only that applies to Jesus, but the terminology man itself. We'll not read the whole quotation again, but in chapter 2 of Hebrews, once the passage is quoted, then we get the application there at the end of verse 8. The end of the quote says, "You have put all things in subjection under His feet. For in subjecting all things to Him," the writer explains, "He left nothing that is not subject to Him. But now we do not yet see all things subjected to Him." So in this creation mandate in which man is going to have dominion over all the earth and all of creation is going to be subjected to man, Hebrews chapter 2 says that has not happened with respect to mankind. We don't see that. We don't see man in dominion over all the earth. We don't see all of creation subjected to him. But we do see a man, and I might suggest the man, to whom all of creation has been subjected, and that is Jesus. Because of the suffering of death, now crowned with glory and honor. He now, verse 10, it was fitting for Him, for whom are all things, and through whom are all things. Hebrews 1 talks about Christ as Creator. In bringing many sons to glory, to perfect the author of their salvation through suffering. For both He who sanctifies and those who are sanctified are from one Father, and for this reason He is not ashamed to call them brethren. Jesus became man so that He might fulfill the promise to man to have dominion over all the earth. God is going to fulfill Psalm 8, not through mankind in general, at least not unaided by Christ, because of the fall. When the fall took place, that rosy picture we saw in the first chapter of Genesis was pretty much shattered. And so how can the language of Psalm 8 really be fulfilled? The language of human dominion over all of creation. I would suggest to you that Hebrews chapter 2 explains a third purpose for Christ becoming man. And that purpose is so that Christ could fulfill the psalm for us. Through Christ, all of us now will be able to have dominion over all the earth. The creation mandate now will be fulfilled through us as we do that through Christ. And so I would take the word man, not just son of man, but the word man in that psalm and see that as being applied to Christ. And I might even be tempted to capitalize the word man. And so think of Jesus, the man, capital M, as the fulfillment of Psalm 8. And I would suggest that's what makes this a Messianic psalm.